The shotgun blast echoed across the empty fields like thunder on a clear day. 72-year-old Harold Mitchell stood on his front porch, his weathered hands gripping the old double barrel that had belonged to his father. Smoke curled from the barrel as 3 HOA patrol officers scrambled backward, their clipboards flying into the dirt. "I told you once," Harold said, his voice steady as stone. "This is private property. You got no business here." The lead officer, a man in a crisp polo shirt with Meadowbrook Community Patrol stitched on the pocket, pointed a shaking finger at the old rancher. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, old man. We're calling the police right now." Harold didn't flinch. He cracked open the shotgun, letting the spent shell fall to the wooden boards beneath his boots. "Go ahead and call them. I'll be right here waiting." But what none of them knew was that this moment had been building for 6 long months. And what happened next would change everything for everyone in Meadowbrook County. Before we continue this incredible story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you want to see what happens to Harold and find out the shocking truth behind this confrontation, make sure you hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. 6 months earlier, Harold Mitchell woke up the same way he had for the past 47 years. The rooster crowed at exactly 5:15 in the morning. The old wooden floorboards creaked under his feet as he made his way to the kitchen, and the smell of coffee filled the small farmhouse that his grandfather had built with his own 2 hands back in 1923. Harold's ranch wasn't big, just about 80 acres of rolling hills, a few dozen cattle, some chickens, and a vegetable garden that his late wife Martha had started 30 years ago. He kept that garden going even now, 3 years after she passed. It was his way of keeping her memory alive. The ranch sat on the edge of what used to be nothing but farmland. Harold remembered when he could stand on his front porch and see nothing but open fields for miles in every direction. His nearest neighbor had been old Tom Patterson, who lived about 2 miles down the dirt road. They used to share Sunday dinners and help each other during harvest season. But times had changed. 5 years ago, a big development company bought up all the land surrounding Harold's property. They built a fancy new neighborhood called Meadowbrook Estates. Suddenly, where there used to be cornfields and pastures, there were now hundreds of identical houses with perfectly green lawns and 3-car garages. Harold didn't mind the new neighbors at first. He figured people needed places to live, and he wasn't one to stand in the way of progress. He even baked some of his famous apple pies and brought them over to welcome the new families. Most of them were nice enough. Young couples with little kids who would wave at him when he drove his old pickup truck past their houses. But then came the HOA. The Meadowbrook Homeowners Association was created to make sure everyone in the new neighborhood followed the rules. Rules about what color you could paint your house. Rules about how tall your grass could grow. Rules about what kind of mailbox you could have. Rules about everything you could possibly imagine. Now, Harold's ranch wasn't part of Meadowbrook Estates. His family had owned this land since before anyone in that HOA was even born. He had the deed to prove it, signed and recorded at the county courthouse. His property was completely separate from the development, but that didn't stop Brenda Thornton. Brenda was the president of the Meadowbrook HOA, and she ran it like she was the queen of a small country. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and glasses that always sat at the tip of her nose. She wore pantsuits every single day, even on weekends, and she carried a clipboard everywhere she went, writing down every little thing she saw that didn't meet her standards. Harold first met Brenda on a Tuesday morning in March. He was out in his front yard, fixing a section of his old wooden fence that had been damaged in a winter storm. His cattle had been using that fence line for decades, and he needed to get it repaired before any of them wandered off. A shiny white SUV pulled up at the edge of his property. Brenda stepped out, clipboard in hand, and marched right up to where Harold was working. "Good morning," she said, but her voice didn't sound friendly at all. "I'm Brenda Thornton, president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association." Harold wiped the sweat from his forehead and nodded politely. "Morning, ma'am. Name's Harold. What can I do for you?" Brenda looked down at her clipboard and made a little clicking sound with her tongue. "Well, Mr. Harold, I'm here to discuss some concerns that have been raised by the community." Harold leaned against his fence post. "Concerns? What kind of concerns?" "Your property," Brenda said, waving her hand at the ranch behind him. "It's become quite an eyesore. The residents of Meadowbrook Estates paid good money for their homes, and they expect a certain standard in the neighborhood." Harold couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this ranch has been here for 100 years. It was here long before your neighborhood existed." Brenda pushed her glasses up her nose. "That may be true. But times change, Mr. Harold. We live in a community now. And in a community, everyone needs to follow the rules." She pulled a piece of paper from her clipboard and handed it to Harold. It was a list of violations. According to the HOA, His fence was too old and needed to be replaced with a modern vinyl fence. His barn needed to be repainted. His cattle were creating unpleasant smells that drifted into the neighborhood. His rooster was too loud in the mornings, and his old pickup truck was an eyesore that should be parked inside a garage. Harold read the list twice, just to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Then he looked up at Brenda with tired eyes. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I don't mean to be rude, but I'm not part of your HOA. I never signed any papers. I never agreed to any rules. This is my land, and it's been my family's land for 4 generations." Brenda smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse right before it pounces. "Mr. Harold, I understand this might be difficult for you to accept, but the world moves forward. Either you move with it, or it moves right over you." She turned and walked back to her SUV without another word. Harold stood there holding that paper for a long time after she left. He thought about his grandfather, who had cleared this land with nothing but an axe and a dream. He thought about his father, who had survived the Great Depression by working this soil from sunrise to sunset. He thought about Martha, who had loved this place more than anywhere else on earth, and he made a decision right then and there. He wasn't going anywhere. Over the next few weeks, Harold went about his business as usual. He fixed his fence. He tended to his cattle. He worked in Martha's garden. He tried to forget about Brenda Thornton and her silly clipboard, but Brenda didn't forget about him. The letters started arriving in early April. Official-looking envelopes with the Meadowbrook HOA logo stamped on the front. Each one contained a new violation notice. Each one threatened fines and legal action if Harold didn't comply. Harold threw them all in the trash. Then the patrol car showed up. It was a Monday morning when Harold first saw it. A white sedan with Meadowbrook Community Patrol written on the side in big blue letters. It drove slowly past his property, stopping at the edge of his driveway. A young man in a polo shirt sat behind the wheel, taking pictures of Harold's ranch with a fancy camera. Harold walked out to meet him. "Can I help you, son?" The young man looked nervous. "Just doing my job, sir. HOA asked me to document the property." "Well, you're documenting from the public road, so I suppose that's your right," Harold said calmly. "But don't you set one foot on my land without permission." The young man nodded quickly and drove away, but he came back the next day, and the day after that. Every single morning, that patrol car would cruise past Harold's property, and that young man would snap his pictures. Harold tried to be patient. He reminded himself that getting angry never solved anything. Martha used to say that kindness was like water on a fire. It could put out even the hottest flames if you used enough of it, so Harold decided to try kindness. One morning, instead of confronting the patrol officer, Harold walked out to the road carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee and a plate of homemade cookies. He approached the patrol car with a friendly smile. "Morning, son. Thought you might like something warm. Gets chilly out here early in the morning." The young man looked surprised. His name tag said Kevin, and he couldn't have been older than 25. He hesitated for a moment, then rolled down his window. "That's real nice of you, sir, but I'm not supposed to accept anything from residents." Harold chuckled. "I'm not a resident, and these are just cookies. My wife used to make them. I'm still trying to get her recipe right." Kevin looked at the cookies, then back at Harold. Something in the old man's eyes must have touched him, because he reached out and took a cookie. "Thank you, sir. And I'm sorry about all this. I'm just doing what they tell me." Harold nodded. "I know, son. I know you are. But can I ask you something? Do you think what they're doing is right?" Kevin was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "No, sir. I don't. But I need this job." Harold patted the young man's shoulder. "I understand. Times are hard. You do what you need to do to take care of yourself. No hard feelings." Kevin drove away that morning with tears in his eyes, and Harold went back to his porch, hoping that maybe things would get better, but they didn't. 3 days later, Harold woke up to the sound of footsteps on his property. He looked out his window and saw something that made his blood run cold. 3 HOA patrol officers were walking through his cattle pasture, taking measurements and photographs. They were on his land, without permission, without asking, just walking around like they owned the place. Harold's heart pounded in his chest as he watched those 3 figures moving through his pasture. The morning sun was just starting to peek over the hills, casting long shadows across the grass. His cattle had noticed the strangers too. They were getting restless, moving away from the unfamiliar people in their space. Harold took a deep breath and reminded himself to stay calm. Martha always said that anger was like a wild horse. If you let it run free, it would trample everything in its path. But if you held the reins tight, you could control where it went. He put on his boots and his old denim jacket and walked out the front door. He didn't rush. He didn't yell. He just walked steadily toward the pasture, his boots crunching on the gravel path. As he got closer, he could see who was leading the group. It was Brenda Thornton herself, clipboard in hand as always. With her were 2 men in Meadowbrook patrol uniforms. They were busy measuring the distance between Harold's barn and the property line that bordered the neighborhood. "Morning, folks," Harold called out, keeping his voice friendly. "Something I can help you with?" Brenda looked up from her clipboard with that same cold smile she had worn the first time they met. "Good morning, Mr. Harold. We're conducting an official survey of the area." Harold stopped about 10 feet away from them. "A survey? On my property? This is a community matter," Brenda said. "We have reason to believe that some of your structures may be encroaching on Meadowbrook land. We need to verify the property lines." Harold felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "Ma'am, the property lines were established 100 years ago. They're recorded at the county courthouse. If you want to see them, you can go down there and look them up yourself." Brenda made a little note on her clipboard. "We prefer to conduct our own surveys. The county records are often outdated." Harold shook his head slowly. "That may be how you do things in your neighborhood, but this is my land, and you're standing on it without my permission." One of the patrol officers, a big man with a thick neck and sunglasses, stepped forward. "Sir, we have authorization from the HOA board to conduct this survey. We suggest you let us do our job." Harold looked at the big man for a long moment. He thought about all the things he could say. He thought about all the ways this could go wrong. But then he thought about Martha, and he chose the path of peace. "Tell you what," Harold said. "How about we all go inside and have a cup of coffee? We can talk this over, like civilized people. I'll show you my deed. You can see the property lines for yourself, and we can figure this whole thing out." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "We don't have time for coffee, Mr. Harold. We have a schedule to keep." "Then I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Harold said firmly. "You're welcome to come back with a proper appointment, and I'll be happy to show you whatever documents you need to see. But right now, you're trespassing." The word hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Brenda's face turned a slight shade of red. The two patrol officers exchanged glances. "Trespassing?" Brenda repeated, her voice getting higher. "We are representatives of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. We have every right to be here." Harold shook his head. "No, ma'am, you don't. This land isn't part of your association. Never has been, never will be. I've tried to be neighborly about this whole situation, but you're pushing too hard. Now please, leave my property." For a moment, nobody moved. The cattle watched from a distance, their big eyes blinking in the morning light. A crow called out from somewhere in the trees. The wind rustled through the tall grass. Then Brenda did something that surprised Harold. She laughed. It wasn't a nice laugh. It was a sharp, mocking sound that cut through the peaceful morning air like a knife. "Oh, Mr. Harold," she said, shaking her head. "You really don't understand how the world works, do you? This isn't about deeds or property lines. This is about progress. This is about community standards. This is about making sure that one stubborn old man doesn't drag down the property values of an entire neighborhood." She took a step closer to Harold, her eyes cold and hard. "We've already talked to our lawyers. We've already filed the paperwork. In 6 months, maybe less, this land will be condemned. The county will buy it from you whether you like it or not. And then we'll tear down this ugly old farm and build something beautiful in its place." Harold felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart. Something deeper than that. Something that had been holding all his patience and kindness together. "You're going to take my land," he said quietly. "We're going to improve this community," Brenda corrected him. "And if you're smart, you'll take whatever money they offer and find yourself a nice retirement home somewhere. Somewhere, far away from here." Harold stood very still for a long moment. The two patrol officers shifted nervously, sensing that something had changed in the old man's demeanor. When Harold finally spoke, his voice was different, harder, like steel wrapped in velvet. "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave my property, and I'm not going to ask again." Brenda opened her mouth to respond, but one of the patrol officers put a hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, maybe we should go. We can come back with the sheriff if we need to." Brenda shook off his hand. "We're not going anywhere until we finish this survey. This old fool doesn't scare me." That was when Harold made his decision. He turned around and walked back toward his house without another word. Brenda called after him, saying something about how running away wouldn't solve anything. But Harold wasn't running away. He was going to get his phone. Inside the farmhouse, Harold picked up the old telephone that hung on the kitchen wall. It was an ancient thing, the kind with a curly cord that stretched across the room. He dialed the number for the county sheriff's office from memory. "Sheriff's Department," a woman's voice answered. "Morning, Denise," Harold said. "This is Harold Mitchell out on Route 7. I've got some folks trespassing on my property, and they won't leave when I ask them to. I was hoping you could send someone out here." "Oh, hey, Harold," Denise said. He could hear her typing on a computer. "Trespassers, you say? That's not like you to have trouble out there." "It's those HOA folks from the new development," Harold explained. "They seem to think they can walk onto my land whenever they please. Denise sighed. Yeah. We've been getting a lot of calls about them lately. I'll send Deputy Williams out there right away. Should be about 20 minutes. Thank you, Denise. I appreciate it. Harold hung up the phone and looked out the window. Brenda and her patrol officers were still in his pasture, taking more measurements and photographs. They hadn't left. They probably thought Harold had given up. They were wrong. Harold sat down in his old rocking chair on the front porch and waited. He watched as his cattle moved further and further away from the strangers, gathering in the far corner of the pasture. Those cows had been on this land for generations. Their great-great-grandmothers had grazed on this same grass. They knew when something wasn't right. 25 minutes later, a brown sheriff's cruiser came rolling up the dirt road. Deputy Williams stepped out, adjusting his hat as he looked around the property. "Morning, Harold," he said, walking up to the porch. "Denise said you're having some trouble?" Harold nodded and pointed toward the pasture. "Those three over there. Asked them to leave twice. They refused." Deputy Williams squinted at the figures in the distance. "That the HOA president? Brenda something?" "Thornton," Harold confirmed. "She's been causing me grief for months. But today she crossed a line." The deputy nodded slowly. "All right. Let me go have a word with them." Harold watched as Deputy Williams walked out into the pasture. He couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the body language. Brenda stood with her hands on her hips, gesturing angrily at the deputy. The two patrol officers hung back, looking uncomfortable. The conversation went on for several minutes. At one point, Brenda pointed her finger right in the deputy's face. Harold shook his head. That woman had no sense at all. Finally, Deputy Williams seemed to have had enough. He pointed firmly toward the road. And after a long moment of hesitation, Brenda and her officers began walking that way. The deputy followed behind them, making sure they actually left. When they reached their vehicles parked on the road, Brenda turned and looked back at Harold's farmhouse. Even from that distance, Harold could see the hatred in her eyes. "This isn't over," she shouted. "You hear me, old man? This isn't over." Harold said nothing. He just sat in his rocking chair and watched as they got in their cars and drove away. Deputy Williams walked back up to the porch, shaking his head. "That woman is something else. I'll tell you that much." "Did she give you any trouble?" Harold asked. "Nothing I couldn't handle. But Harold, I gotta be honest with you. She's serious about this whole thing. She told me they've got lawyers working on getting your land condemned. Something about it being a public nuisance." Harold nodded slowly. "She mentioned that. Now, I don't know much about that legal stuff," the deputy continued. "But I think you should talk to a lawyer yourself. Someone who can tell you what your rights are." Harold thanked the deputy for his help and his advice. After Williams drove away, Harold sat on his porch for a long time, thinking. He thought about the land around him. Every tree, every rock, every blade of grass held a memory. Over there by the old oak tree was where he had proposed to Martha 51 years ago. Down by the creek was where his son Billy had caught his first fish. In the barn was the same tractor his father had taught him to drive when he was just 8 years old. This wasn't just land. This was his life. His whole life, wrapped up in 80 acres of dirt and grass and memories. The thought of losing it made his chest ache in a way that scared him. But Harold Mitchell had never been a man who gave up easily. His grandfather hadn't given up when the bank tried to take the farm during the Depression. His father hadn't given up when a drought killed half their crops 3 years in a row. And Harold wasn't going to give up now. He went inside and started looking for his important papers. The next few days were busy. Harold drove into town and met with a lawyer named Patricia Chen. She was a young woman, not much older than his granddaughter, but she had sharp eyes and a sharper mind. She looked over all of Harold's documents and assured him that his ownership of the land was rock solid. "They can't just take your property because they don't like how it looks," Patricia explained. "For them to condemn your land, they'd have to prove it's a genuine public health or safety hazard. A working farm doesn't qualify." Harold felt a weight lift off his shoulders. "So they can't do anything?" Patricia hesitated. "I didn't say that. They can make your life very difficult. They can file lawsuits. They can tie things up in court for years. They can bleed you dry with legal fees. That's how these HOAs operate sometimes. They know most people can't afford to fight." Harold thought about his savings account. Martha's medical bills had taken most of what they had. There wasn't much left. "How much would it cost to fight them?" he asked. Patricia looked at him with sympathy in her eyes. "Honestly, if they really want to push this, it could cost tens of thousands of dollars. Maybe more." Harold drove home that day feeling lower than he had in years. He sat on his porch as the sun went down, watching the colors change across the sky, orange and pink and purple, painting the clouds like Martha used to paint her watercolors. He missed her so much it hurt. That night, Harold did something he hadn't done in a long time. He prayed. He got down on his knees beside his bed, just like his mother had taught him when he was a little boy, and he asked God for guidance. "I don't know what to do," he whispered in the darkness. "I've tried to be kind, I've tried to be patient, but they want to take everything from me. Everything Martha and I built together. I need help, please. Send me some help." He climbed into bed and fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, Harold woke to the sound of knocking on his front door. He looked at the clock. It was barely 7 in the morning. Who would be visiting this early? He pulled on his robe and walked to the door, half expecting to find Brenda Thornton standing there with another list of violations. But it wasn't Brenda. It was Kevin, the young patrol officer, the one Harold had given cookies to, and he looked absolutely terrified. Kevin stood on the porch, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like a nervous child. His patrol uniform was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept all night. In his hands, he clutched a brown envelope so tightly that the paper was starting to crinkle. "Kevin?" Harold said, surprised. "What are you doing here, son?" Kevin looked over his shoulder at the empty road behind him. Then he looked back at Harold with wide, frightened eyes. "Can I come in, sir, please? I need to talk to you, and I can't let anyone see me here." Harold studied the young man's face for a moment. Whatever was going on, Kevin was genuinely scared. Harold stepped aside and held the door open. "Come on in, I'll put some coffee on." Kevin hurried inside like he was being chased by ghosts. He sat down at the kitchen table, while Harold started the coffee maker. Neither of them spoke until the coffee was poured and Harold had taken his seat across from the young man. "All right," Harold said gently. "Take your time. Tell me what's going on." Kevin stared down at the brown envelope in his hands. His fingers were shaking slightly. "I'm going to lose my job for this," he said quietly. "Maybe worse. But I couldn't sleep last night. I kept thinking about what you said to me, about whether what they're doing is right." He looked up at Harold with tears forming in the corners of his eyes. "It's not right, sir. What they're doing to you. What they've done to other people. It's not right at all." Harold felt his heart soften toward this young man. He reached across the table and put his weathered hand on Kevin's arm. "Whatever it is, son, you can tell me. I'm not going to judge you." Kevin took a deep, shaky breath. Then he opened the brown envelope and pulled out a stack of papers. He spread them across the kitchen table. "I work in the HOA office sometimes," Kevin explained. "Filing papers, making copies, stuff like that. Last week, Mrs. Thornton asked me to make copies of some documents. She didn't know I actually read them." Harold looked down at the papers. There were emails, meeting minutes, legal documents, lots of words he didn't understand. But some things jumped out at him. "What am I looking at here?" he asked. Kevin pointed to one of the emails. "This is from Mrs. Thornton to a man named Richard Crane. He's a real estate developer, a big one. He builds shopping centers and apartment complexes all over the state." Harold read the email slowly. Some of the words were confusing, but the meaning was clear enough. "She's promising him my land," Harold said quietly. "She's telling him she can get my land condemned, and then he can buy it for cheap." Kevin nodded. "That's not all. Look at this one." He pointed to another document. It was some kind of financial record. Harold squinted at the numbers. "I don't understand what this means," he admitted. "It's a payment," Kevin said. "From Richard Crane's company to Brenda Thornton. $50,000. It's listed as a consulting fee, but look at the date. It was paid 3 days after the HOA board voted to pursue legal action against you." Harold felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "She's being paid to take my land," he said. "This whole thing, all those violation notices, all those patrols, it was never about community standards. It was about money." Kevin nodded miserably. "There's more. You're not the only one. There are 3 other families who had land near the development, small farms, like yours. All of them got the same treatment. Violation notices, patrols, legal threats. 2 of them gave up and sold their land for way less than it was worth. The 3rd family is still fighting, but they're almost out of money." Harold thought about those other families, people he didn't know, going through the same nightmare he was living. It made his blood boil in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Why are you showing me this?" Harold asked. "Why risk your job?" Kevin wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Because you were kind to me. Nobody in that office has ever been kind to me. They treat me like I'm invisible, like I'm just a machine that takes pictures and files papers." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "My grandmother raised me," he continued. "She had a little house on a piece of land about the size of yours. When I was a kid, that house was my whole world. I loved every inch of it, and then she got sick, and the medical bills piled up, and she had to sell it to pay for her treatment. It broke her heart. She died 6 months later." Kevin's voice cracked, and a tear rolled down his cheek. "When you gave me those cookies and talked about your wife, it reminded me of her. And I thought about what she would say if she knew I was helping people like Mrs. Thornton take land away from people like you. She would be so ashamed of me." Harold felt his own eyes getting wet. He got up from his chair and walked around the table. Then he did something that surprised both of them. He hugged the young man. "Your grandmother would be proud of you right now," Harold said softly. "What you're doing takes courage. Real courage." They stayed like that for a moment. Two people from different generations, connected by loss and kindness, and the simple desire to do what was right. When they finally pulled apart, Harold looked at the documents on the table with new determination in his eyes. "What do I do with this?" he asked. "How do I use it?" Kevin thought for a moment. "You need to get it to someone who can do something with it. A lawyer, maybe. Or the newspaper. If people found out what Mrs. Thornton is really doing, the whole thing would fall apart." Harold nodded slowly. He thought about Patricia Chen, the lawyer he had visited. She would know what to do with this information. "Kevin," Harold said seriously, "if I use these documents, people are going to find out where they came from. You could get in a lot of trouble." Kevin squared his shoulders, and for a moment, he looked older than his 25 years. "I know, but some things are more important than staying out of trouble. My grandmother taught me that." Harold smiled. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman." "She was," Kevin said. "She really was." They talked for a while longer, making a plan. Kevin would go to work as usual, and act like nothing had happened. Harold would take the documents to his lawyer and figure out the next steps. They agreed not to contact each other again until it was safe. Before Kevin left, Harold pressed something into his hand. It was a small wooden cross on a leather string. Simple, old, worn smooth from years of handling. "This belonged to my father," Harold said. "He gave it to me when I was about your age. He said it would protect me when I needed it most. I want you to have it." Kevin looked at the cross with wonder. "I can't take this, sir. It's a family treasure." "Family isn't just about blood," Harold said. "Family is about the people who stand with you when times get hard. You stood with me today, Kevin. That makes you family." Kevin clutched the cross to his chest, fresh tears streaming down his face. He couldn't find words, so he just nodded and hurried out to his car. Harold watched him drive away, then looked down at the stack of documents on his kitchen table. For the first time in months, he felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. He spent the rest of the morning organizing the papers and making notes. Then he called Patricia Chen's office and scheduled an appointment for the next day. That afternoon, Harold decided to take a walk around his property. He needed to clear his head and think about everything that had happened. He walked past the barn, past the chicken coop, past Martha's garden. He walked all the way to the back fence, where his land ended, and the Meadowbrook development began. He could see the houses from here. Row after row of identical homes with their identical lawns and identical mailboxes. They looked like toys from this distance, like something a child would set up in a sandbox. Harold wondered about the people living in those houses. Were they happy? Did they know what their HOA was doing in their name? Probably not. Most people just wanted to live their lives in peace. They didn't pay attention to the politics and the power games happening around them. He thought about what Martha would say about all of this. She had always been better with people than he was. She could walk into a room full of strangers and walk out with 10 new friends. She had a gift for seeing the good in people, even when they made it hard to find. "What would you do, Martha?" Harold whispered to the wind. "How would you handle this?" The wind rustled through the trees, but no answer came. Harold smiled sadly. He knew what she would say. She would tell him to be brave, but also to be kind, to fight for what was right, but never to lose himself in the fighting. He headed back toward the house, his mind full of thoughts and plans. He was about halfway across the pasture when he heard it. The sound of engines. Multiple engines, coming up the dirt road toward his property. Harold stopped and turned to look. His heart sank. 3 white SUVs with the Meadowbrook Community Patrol logo were pulling up to his property line. And behind them was a black sedan that Harold didn't recognize. The vehicles stopped, and doors started opening. Harold counted the people as they got out. 6 patrol officers in their polo shirts and khaki pants. Brenda Thornton with her ever-present clipboard, and a man in an expensive suit who Harold had never seen before. The man in the suit was tall with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He carried himself like someone who was used to getting whatever he wanted. When he walked, the others moved out of his way automatically. This, Harold realized, must be Richard Crane. They didn't stop at the property line this time. They walked right onto Harold's land like they owned it. All 8 of them, marching across his pasture like an invading army. Harold's hands balled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. He walked toward them, meeting them in the middle of the field. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice steady. "Again. I've already called the sheriff once this week. I'll call him again." Brenda laughed that sharp, cold laugh of hers. "Go ahead and call him. By the time he gets here, we'll be done." The man in the suit stepped forward. Up close, Harold could see that his eyes were the color of dirty ice, cold and hard and completely without warmth. "Mr. Mitchell," the man said. "My name is Richard Crane. I think it's time we had a conversation about your property." Harold met his gaze without flinching. "I have nothing to say to you." Crane smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's unfortunate, because I have quite a lot to say to you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a purchase offer. $300,000 for your entire property. That's more than fair for land like this, more than you'd get anywhere else." Harold didn't even look at the paper. "My land isn't for sale. Everything is for sale, Mr. Mitchell. It's just a matter of finding the right price." Harold shook his head. "You don't understand. My family has owned this land for 100 years. My grandfather built that house with his own hands. My wife is buried under that old oak tree over there. There's no price high enough." Something flickered in Crane's eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or frustration. He wasn't used to people telling him no. "Let me be clear about your situation," Crane said, his voice getting harder. "We have lawyers who do nothing but find ways to take properties like this, eminent domain, zoning violations, environmental concerns. One way or another, this land is going to be developed. The only question is whether you walk away with $300,000 in your pocket, or whether you walk away with nothing." Harold felt the anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. He thought about Kevin, about the documents sitting on his kitchen table, about the plan they had made. "I think we're done here," Harold said. "You and your people need to leave my property. Now." Crane didn't move. Neither did anyone else. "I don't think you heard me," Crane said slowly. "We're not leaving until we reach an understanding." Harold looked at the 8 people surrounding him. The patrol officers looked nervous, like they knew they were doing something wrong. Brenda looked smug, enjoying every moment of Harold's discomfort, and Crane just looked cold. Cold, and dangerous, and absolutely certain that he was going to win. Harold realized something in that moment. These people weren't going to stop. They weren't going to give up. They were going to keep pushing and pushing until they got what they wanted, or until Harold pushed back hard enough to make them stop, and he was done being pushed. "I'm going to walk to my house now," Harold said quietly. "And then I'm going to call the sheriff. If you're smart, you'll be gone before he gets here." He turned and started walking toward the farmhouse. Behind him, he heard Crane's voice. "Follow him. Don't let him make that call." Harold heard footsteps behind him, fast footsteps, getting closer. He didn't turn around. He just kept walking, his heart pounding in his chest. He made it to the porch steps before one of the patrol officers grabbed his arm. "Sorry, old-timer," the man said. "You're not going anywhere." Harold looked at the hand on his arm, then up at the face of the man holding him. It wasn't Kevin. It was one of the others. A man with a cruel smile and eyes that held no kindness at all. The others were catching up now, forming a circle around the porch. Harold was surrounded. Brenda walked up to him with her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "This could have been so easy, Mr. Harold. All you had to do was be reasonable. But you just had to be stubborn, didn't you?" Harold said nothing. He was thinking, calculating. His eyes moved to the front door of his house. It was only a few feet away, and just inside that door, hanging above the fireplace, was his father's old double-barrel shotgun. He had never pointed that gun at another person in his entire life. He had used it for hunting when he was younger, for scaring off coyotes that got too close to the chicken coop. But never for this, never for threatening another human being. But these people were on his land, in his home, touching him against his will, and they weren't going to leave. Harold made his choice. In one quick motion, he yanked his arm free from the patrol officer's grip and lunged for the door. He was old, but he was still strong from years of farm work. The officer stumbled backward in surprise. Harold threw open the door, rushed inside, and grabbed the shotgun from above the fireplace. His hands found the shells in the drawer below automatically, loading them with the muscle memory of 50 years. When he turned back to the door, they were already coming up the porch steps. Harold stepped onto the porch, raised the shotgun, and fired into the sky. The blast shattered the morning silence like a thunderclap. Birds exploded from the nearby trees, filling the sky with panicked wings. The patrol officers froze on the porch steps, their faces turning white as paper. One of them actually fell backward, tumbling down the stairs and landing hard on his backside in the dirt. Brenda screamed and dropped her clipboard. The papers scattered in the wind, dancing across the yard like frightened butterflies. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. Only Richard Crane didn't run. He stood perfectly still at the bottom of the steps, his cold eyes fixed on Harold and the smoking shotgun in his hands. Harold cracked open the barrel and let the spent shell fall to the wooden porch. It made a soft clinking sound as it rolled to a stop against the railing. Then, slowly and deliberately, he loaded another shell. "That was your one warning," Harold said, his voice steady as a rock. "The next one won't be aimed at the sky." The patrol officers were backing away now, their hands raised in the air. They wanted no part of this. Whatever they were being paid, it wasn't enough to get shot by a crazy old farmer. Brenda had recovered enough to find her voice. "You're insane," she shrieked. "You just committed assault with a deadly weapon. You're going to prison." Harold kept the shotgun leveled at the group. "I fired into the air on my own property. That's not assault. That's a warning to trespassers who refuse to leave when asked." He looked at each of them in turn, making sure they understood he was serious. "Now, I'm going to say this one more time. Get off my land. All of you. Right now." The patrol officers didn't need to be told twice. They practically ran back to their SUVs, climbing over each other in their hurry to get away. Engines roared to life, and tires kicked up clouds of dust as they peeled out onto the road. Brenda stood her ground for a moment longer, her face twisted with rage. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "I promise you, you will regret this." Then she turned and marched toward one of the remaining vehicles, her heels sinking into the soft earth with every step. Only Richard Crane remained. He stood at the edge of Harold's property, his hands in the pockets of his expensive suit, looking at Harold like he was studying a particularly interesting insect. "That was a mistake," Crane said calmly. "A very big mistake." Harold kept the shotgun ready. "The only mistake I made was being too patient with you people for too long." Crane smiled that cold, empty smile of his. "You think you've won something here today. You think firing that gun makes you powerful. But you don't understand how the world works, Mr. Mitchell. Power doesn't come from guns. It comes from money. And I have more money than you could ever imagine." Harold felt something twist in his gut, but he didn't let it show on his face. "I've seen your documents," Harold said quietly. "I know about the payments to Brenda. I know about the other families you drove off their land. I know everything." For the first time, something flickered in Crane's eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or concern. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. But Harold saw it. "I don't know what you think you know," Crane said carefully. "But I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't prove." "I can prove plenty," Harold replied. "Emails, financial records, meeting minutes, all of it, sitting on my kitchen table right now." Crane was silent for a long moment. The wind blew across the empty fields, carrying the smell of grass and dirt and something else. Something that smelled like fear. "Where did you get those documents?" Crane asked, his voice dangerously soft. Harold said nothing. He wasn't about to put Kevin in danger. Crane's jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter. Whatever you have, my lawyers will tear it apart. They'll say it was stolen. They'll say it was faked. They'll say whatever they need to say to make it go away." He took a step closer to the property line, his eyes locked on Harold's. "And then, when you're bankrupt from legal fees and exhausted from fighting, I'll come back, and I'll take this land for pennies on the dollar. That's how this works, Mr. Mitchell. That's how it always works." Harold felt his finger tighten on the trigger. Not to fire. Just to remind himself it was there. "Get off my property," he said. "Now." Crane held his gaze for another long moment. Then he turned and walked slowly back to his black sedan. He didn't hurry. He didn't look scared. He moved like a man who had all the time in the world. As he opened the car door, he looked back at Harold one last time. "See you soon, Mr. Mitchell." Then he got in the car and drove away. Harold stood on his porch for a long time after they were gone. His hands were shaking now that the danger had passed. The shotgun felt heavy in his grip, heavier than it had ever felt before. He went inside and put the gun back above the fireplace. Then he sat down in his kitchen chair and stared at the documents spread across his table. What had he done? He had made enemies of powerful people. He had threatened them with a weapon. He had told them he knew their secrets, and now they would be coming for him with everything they had. Harold put his head in his hands and tried to breathe. The phone rang, making him jump. He stared at it for a moment, wondering if he should answer. What if it was Crane? What if it was a lawyer, already threatening him with lawsuits? He picked up the phone. "Harold," it was Deputy Williams' voice. "Harold, are you okay? We got a call saying there were gunshots at your property." Harold let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. "I'm fine, Marcus. Just had some unwanted visitors who wouldn't leave. I fired a warning shot into the air to encourage them." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Harold, you know I have to come out there and take a report. Discharging a firearm, even on your own property, when there are people around. It's complicated." "I understand," Harold said. "Come on out. I'll tell you everything." Deputy Williams arrived about 30 minutes later. Harold told him the whole story. From the beginning. The harassment, the threats, the trespassing, the confrontation with Crane. He showed the deputy the documents Kevin had brought him, explaining how he had gotten them without revealing Kevin's name. Williams read through the papers with growing amazement on his face. "Harold," he said slowly, "if this is real, this is serious. Like, federal crime serious. bribery, fraud, conspiracy. These people could go to prison. That's why I need to get it to someone who can do something about it, Harold said. My lawyer, the newspaper, someone. Williams nodded thoughtfully. What about the state attorney general's office? They handle corruption cases like this. If you give them these documents, they could open an investigation. Harold hadn't thought about that. Would they listen to me? I'm just an old farmer. You're a citizen with evidence of a crime, Williams said. They have to listen. After the deputy left, Harold sat down and wrote a letter. It took him 3 drafts to get it right. He explained who he was, what had been happening, and what he had discovered. He made copies of all the documents and put everything in a big envelope addressed to the state attorney general's office. The next morning, he drove into town and mailed the package. Then he stopped by Patricia Chen's office and gave her copies of everything too. This changes things significantly, Patricia said, her eyes wide as she flipped through the pages. If we can prove that Brenda Thornton was taking bribes to abuse her position, the whole case against you falls apart, and Crane could face serious legal consequences. Harold nodded. How long before something happens? Patricia sighed. Government investigations take time, weeks, maybe months, and in the meantime, Crane will probably escalate things. He knows you have these documents now. He'll want to discredit you before you can use them. She was right. The next few weeks were the hardest of Harold's life. First came the lawyers. Crane's legal team filed a lawsuit against Harold for assault and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They claimed that Harold had fired his shotgun directly at the patrol officers, nearly killing them. They demanded $5 million in damages. Then came the newspaper stories. Someone had tipped off a local reporter about the incident at Harold's ranch. But the story that ran wasn't about HOA corruption. It was about a crazy old man threatening innocent community patrol officers with a deadly weapon. The headline read, "Elderly farmer goes on rampage, terrorizes neighborhood watch." Then came the inspectors. Every day, it seemed like someone new showed up at Harold's property. Health inspectors, building inspectors, environmental inspectors. They found violations everywhere. A crack in his barn that was suddenly a structural hazard, a pile of old lumber that was now a fire risk, a section of his fence that was supposedly endangering public safety. The fines piled up. $100 here, $200 there, $500 for this, $1,000 for that. Within 3 weeks, Harold owed over $10,000 in penalties, and through it all, the patrol cars kept coming. Every single day, they would drive slowly past his property, taking pictures, writing notes, watching him. Always watching. Harold stopped sleeping at night. He would lie in his bed, listening to every sound, wondering if someone was going to come for him in the darkness. His appetite disappeared. His clothes started hanging loose on his shrinking frame. Some days, he thought about giving up. Just signing the papers, taking the money, and walking away. Finding some small apartment somewhere and living out his remaining years in quiet defeat. But then he would look at Martha's garden, or touch the wooden cross he had given to Kevin, and then retrieved from his drawer, or sit in the rocking chair where his father used to read the newspaper every morning. And he would remember why he was fighting. This land was worth more than money. It was worth more than peace. It was worth everything he had. One evening, about a month after the shotgun incident, Harold was sitting on his porch watching the sunset. He was tired. More tired than he had ever been. But the sky was beautiful, painted in shades of orange and gold. And for a moment, he could almost forget about everything else. A car came up the dirt road. Harold's stomach tightened. Another inspector? Another lawsuit? More bad news? But when the car got closer, he saw that it wasn't a white SUV or a black sedan. It was an old blue pickup truck, dusty and dented, and held together with hope and rust. The truck pulled up to Harold's house and stopped. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was about Harold's age, maybe a few years younger. Her hair was silver, cut short and practical. Her face was lined with years and weather, but her eyes were sharp and bright. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt, the kind of clothes Harold remembered from his childhood, when everyone around here was a farmer. "Harold Mitchell?" she called out. Harold stood up slowly. "That's me." "Who's asking?" The woman walked toward the porch with a confident stride. "My name is Eleanor Vance. My family owned the farm about 5 miles north of here. The one Crane and his people took 3 years ago." Harold remembered what Kevin had told him about the other families. Eleanor waved her hand dismissively. "Don't be sorry. Be angry. That's why I'm here." She climbed the porch steps and stood facing Harold, her eyes burning with a fire that reminded him of Martha in her younger days. "I heard about what you did," Eleanor said, standing up to them, firing that shotgun, refusing to back down. "Most people would have caved by now. But not you." Harold shrugged. "I don't know how much longer I can hold out. They're coming at me from every direction. Eleanor smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Harold had seen in weeks. That's why I'm here. You're not alone anymore, Harold. There are others. Other people who lost their land. Other people who were pushed around by the HOA. Other people who want to fight back but didn't know how. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a list of names and phone numbers, over 20 of them. We've been watching you, Eleanor said, waiting to see if you were the real deal. And you are. Now we want to help. Harold looked at the list in his hands. 20 names. 20 people who had been hurt by Crane and Brenda and the Meadowbrook HOA. 20 potential allies in a fight he thought he was fighting alone. His eyes filled with tears. He tried to blink them away, but they came anyway, rolling down his weathered cheeks. I don't know what to say, he whispered. Eleanor put her hand on his shoulder. Say you'll let us help. Say you'll keep fighting. Say you'll stand with us like we're ready to stand with you. Harold wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked out at his property, at the land his family had worked for 100 years. Then he looked at Eleanor, at the determination in her eyes and the strength in her stance. He wasn't alone anymore. Okay, he said. Let's fight. Eleanor grinned. That's what I wanted to hear. Now, we've got a lot of work to do. And I think we should start by introducing you to everyone else. There's a meeting tomorrow night at the old community center in town. Can you make it? Harold nodded. I'll be there. Eleanor headed back to her truck, but she paused at the door and looked back at Harold. One more thing, she said. The state attorney general's office received your package. They've opened an official investigation into Richard Crane and the Meadowbrook HOA. Word is, they're taking it very seriously. Harold felt his heart leap in his chest. How do you know that? Eleanor's grin widened. I have a nephew who works in that office. He's not supposed to tell me anything, but family is family. He says they're already talking about subpoenas and grand juries. Crane is in real trouble, Harold. Real trouble? She climbed into her truck and started the engine. Through the open window, she called out one last thing. Get some sleep tonight. You've earned it. Then she was gone. The blue pickup disappearing down the dirt road in a cloud of dust. Harold stood on his porch for a long time after she left, holding the list of names in his hands. The sun had set, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars his grandfather had looked at. The same stars Martha had loved to watch from this very spot. For the first time in months, Harold felt something other than fear and exhaustion. He felt hope. That night, Harold slept better than he had in weeks. He dreamed of Martha, of the early days of their marriage, when they had worked this land side by side. In the dream she smiled at him and said, I knew you could do it, Harold. I always knew. He woke up the next morning feeling stronger than he had in a long time. But the feeling didn't last, because when he walked out onto his porch with his morning coffee, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Someone had spray-painted a message across the side of his barn during the night. Big red letters, ugly and threatening, spelling out words that made Harold's heart pound in his chest. Leave or die. Harold stared at those terrible words until his coffee turned cold in his hands. The red paint dripped down the weathered wood of his barn, like blood from a wound. Someone had been on his property in the middle of the night. Someone had crept through the darkness while he slept, close enough to touch his buildings, close enough to do far worse than spray paint. His first instinct was fear. His second was anger. But his third, the one that finally settled into his bones, was determination. They wanted him to be afraid. They wanted him to run. They wanted him to give up everything his family had built, because of some ugly words painted on a wall. They didn't know Harold Mitchell very well. He went inside and called Deputy Williams. Then he called Patricia Chen. Then he called Eleanor Vance and told her what had happened. Within 2 hours, his property was filled with people. Deputy Williams took photographs of the graffiti and collected what evidence he could find. Patricia Chen documented everything for the ongoing legal case, and Eleanor arrived with 5 other people from her list. Men and women who had suffered at the hands of Crane and the HOA. All of them coming to stand with Harold in his time of need. This is intimidation, Patricia said grimly, looking at the painted threat. It's a crime. And if we can prove Crane or anyone connected to him is responsible, it's going to make things much worse for them. Can we prove it? Harold asked. Patricia shook her head slowly. Not yet. But we're building a case. Every incident like this, every piece of evidence, it all adds up. Eleanor put her hand on Harold's arm. You're not staying here alone tonight. We're setting up a watch schedule. Someone will be here around the clock until this is over. Harold wanted to argue. He had always been independent, always taken care of himself. But looking at the faces of these people who had come to help him, people he barely knew, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about pride anymore. This was about survival. And survival meant accepting help when it was offered. Okay, he said quietly. That night, a man named George Sullivan sat on Harold's porch with a thermos of coffee and a flashlight. George was a retired firefighter whose small farm had been taken by Crane's people 2 years earlier. He had lost everything except his fighting spirit. "You get some sleep," George told Harold. "I've got this." Harold did sleep, though not easily. Every sound made him tense. Every creak of the old house made him wonder if someone was trying to get in, but knowing George was out there, watching over him, made it bearable. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The meeting at the community center was bigger than Harold had expected. Over 30 people showed up, all of them with stories about the Meadowbrook HOA and Richard Crane. Some had lost their homes. Some had been driven into bankruptcy by legal fees. Some were still fighting, like Harold, holding on by their fingernails. They shared their stories one by one, and Harold listened with growing amazement. He had thought he was alone in this fight. He had thought he was the only one stubborn enough to stand up to these people, but he was wrong. There was Margaret Chen, no relation to Patricia, who had run a small flower shop until the HOA decided her business was an eyesore. They had harassed her with inspections and violations, until she was forced to close. There was James and Patricia Williams, a young couple who had bought their dream home in Meadowbrook Estates, only to discover that the HOA fees kept increasing every year. When they complained, Brenda Thornton had made their lives miserable, fining them for everything from their garden gnome to the color of their curtains. There was old Tom Patterson, Harold's former neighbor from down the road. Harold had wondered what happened to Tom after he sold his land. Now he found out. Tom had been pressured and threatened, until he gave in, selling his property for half its value. He had moved into a tiny apartment in town and spent most of his days regretting his decision. "I should have fought," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have stood my ground like you're doing, Harold. But I was scared, and now I've got nothing." Harold reached across and squeezed his old friend's hand. "It's not too late, Tom. We're fighting back now. All of us together." The meeting ended with a plan. They would pool their resources to help pay for legal fees. They would take turns watching each other's properties. They would document every incident of harassment and intimidation. And they would make sure that every newspaper, every television station, and every government office in the state knew what was happening in Meadowbrook County. The next few weeks were hard, but they were also filled with something Harold hadn't felt in a long time. Community, friendship, purpose. Every morning, someone would stop by Harold's ranch to check on him. Sometimes they brought food. Sometimes they brought news. Sometimes they just sat on the porch with him and talked about the old days, before the development, before the HOA, before everything changed. The story started spreading. A reporter from the state capitol came to interview Harold about his experience. She was a young woman named Sarah, with curly red hair and a notebook full of questions. She spent 3 hours at his kitchen table, listening to everything he had to say. "This is a big story," she told him when they were finished. "Corruption, intimidation, powerful people abusing ordinary citizens. People need to hear about this." The article ran the following Sunday. It was on the front page of the state's biggest newspaper, complete with photographs of Harold's ranch, the graffiti on his barn, and copies of the documents Kevin had provided. The headline read, "The Old Farmer, Who Wouldn't Back Down. One Man's Fight Against Corruption." The response was immediate. People from all over the state reached out to offer support. Some sent money, some sent letters of encouragement, some showed up in person, wanting to shake Harold's hand and tell him they were proud of what he was doing. The state attorney general's office announced that they were accelerating their investigation into Richard Crane and the Meadowbrook HOA. They had already issued subpoenas for financial records and were preparing to call witnesses before a grand jury. And then, 3 days after the article ran, the thing Harold had been waiting for finally happened. Brenda Thornton was arrested. Deputy Williams called Harold with the news. Federal agents had shown up at Brenda's home early that morning with a warrant for her arrest. She was being charged with bribery, fraud, and conspiracy. Her bail was set at $500,000. Harold sat down in his rocking chair and let the news wash over him. Brenda Thornton, the woman who had tormented him for months, the woman who had stood in his pasture and told him his land would be taken away, was sitting in a jail cell. It wasn't over yet. Crane was still out there, and his lawyers were still fighting. But this was a victory, a real victory. That evening, everyone gathered at Harold's ranch to celebrate. Eleanor brought homemade fried chicken. George brought apple pie. Tom Patterson brought a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion. They sat around Harold's kitchen table, eating and drinking and laughing like old friends. For a few hours, they forgot about lawsuits and threats and spray-painted barns. They were just people, sharing a meal and enjoying each other's company. After dinner, Harold stepped out onto the porch to get some fresh air. The night was cool and clear, and the stars were shining bright above his fields. He could hear the distant sound of his cattle moving in the pasture, the soft rustle of wind through the grass. Eleanor came out and stood beside him. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Harold thought about the question for a long moment before answering. I feel grateful, he said finally. Grateful for all of you. Grateful that I didn't give up. Grateful that Martha taught me to fight for what matters. Eleanor nodded. She sounds like she was an amazing woman. She was, Harold said. She really was. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars. What do you think happens next? Harold asked. Eleanor shrugged. Crane's lawyers will try to make a deal. They'll try to throw Brenda under the bus and protect their client. But the Attorney General's office has those documents you sent them. They know about the payments. They know about the other families. Crane's going to have a hard time wiggling out of this one. She paused, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. And even if he does escape the legal consequences, his reputation is ruined. No one's going to want to do business with him after this. He's finished in this state, one way or another. Harold nodded slowly. It wasn't perfect justice. Perfect justice would mean getting back everything that had been taken from everyone. Crane had hurt. But it was something. It was more than he had dared to hope for when this all began. 2 months later, Richard Crane pleaded guilty to 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of bribery. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to all the families his schemes had harmed. The Meadowbrook Homeowners Association was dissolved. A new board was elected, made up of actual residents who actually cared about their community. One of the first things they did was issue a formal apology to Harold Mitchell and invite him to their first meeting as a guest of honor. Harold accepted the invitation. He wore his best suit, the one Martha had picked out for him years ago, and drove his old pickup truck into the heart of Meadowbrook Estates. The meeting was held in the community center, a big room with folding chairs and fluorescent lights. When Harold walked in, everyone stood up and applauded. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. But he looked out at all those faces, young and old, and he thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the first time Brenda Thornton had shown up at his property with her clipboard and her cold smile. He thought about the letters and the fines and the patrols. He thought about Kevin, who had risked everything to do the right thing. He thought about the shotgun blast that had echoed across his fields, the moment when everything changed. He thought about Eleanor and George and Tom and all the others who had stood with him when he needed them most. And he thought about Martha, who had always believed in the goodness of people, even when that goodness was hard to find. When the applause died down, Harold cleared his throat and spoke. I'm not much for speeches, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But I want to say something, and I hope you'll hear me out. The room was silent. Waiting. What happened here? It wasn't about me. It wasn't about my land or my ranch or my family's history. It was about something bigger than all of that. It was about what kind of community we want to live in. What kind of people we want to be. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Those folks who ran your HOA before, they thought power meant pushing people around. They thought success meant taking things from other people. They thought the only way to win was to make someone else lose. He shook his head slowly. But that's not how it works. Not really. The truth is, we're all connected. What hurts one of us hurts all of us. What helps one of us helps all of us. The only way any of us really wins is when we lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. Harold looked around the room, meeting the eyes of as many people as he could. I'm just an old farmer. I don't know much about HOAs or developments or any of that stuff, but I know about neighbors. I know about community, and I know that when people come together, when they look out for each other, when they choose kindness over cruelty, there's nothing they can't overcome. He smiled, the first real smile he had worn in a long time. So that's what I hope for all of you. I hope you'll be good neighbors to each other. I hope you'll remember that everyone is fighting their own battles, and a little kindness can make all the difference. And I hope that the next time you see an old farmer out in his fields, you'll wave hello instead of writing him up for violations. The room erupted in laughter and applause. People came up to shake Harold's hand, to hug him, to thank him for everything he had done. After the meeting, Harold drove home as the sun was setting over his fields. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the same colors Martha had loved to paint in her watercolors. He parked his truck and walked out into the pasture, past the barn that still bore faint traces of red paint despite all their efforts to clean it. He walked all the way to the old oak tree where Martha was buried, the place where he had proposed to her 51 years ago. He knelt down beside the simple stone marker and put his hand on the cool granite. We did it, Martha, he whispered. We saved the farm. We saved our home. The wind rustled through the leaves of the old oak tree, and for just a moment, Harold could have sworn he heard Martha's voice, soft and warm, carried on the breeze. I knew you could, Harold. I always knew. He stayed there until the stars came out, talking to Martha about everything that had happened, everything that was going to happen. He told her about Kevin and Eleanor and George. He told her about the meeting and the apology and the new beginning. And when he finally stood up to go back to the house, he didn't feel alone. He never felt alone again. The next spring, Harold planted extra vegetables in Martha's garden, more than he could ever eat by himself. Every week, he loaded up his old pickup truck and drove into Meadowbrook Estates, handing out fresh tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers to anyone who wanted them. The children called him Farmer Harold. They would run up to his truck whenever they saw it, eager to see what he had brought. He always made sure to have a few cookies too, baked from Martha's recipe, the one he had finally gotten right. Kevin eventually left his job with the HOA and went back to school. He was studying to be a social worker, he told Harold in a letter. He wanted to spend his life helping people, not hurting them. He still wore the wooden cross Harold had given him, every single day. Eleanor Vance became the president of the new neighborhood association. Under her leadership, they planted trees, built playgrounds, and established a fund to help families who fell on hard times. She invited Harold to every meeting, and he went to most of them, sitting in the back row and smiling as he watched his neighbors work together. And every evening, Harold sat on his porch and watched the sun set over his land. The land his grandfather had cleared with his own 2 hands. The land his father had saved during the Depression. The land where he had loved and laughed and lived with Martha for nearly 50 years. The land he had fought for, and won. Sometimes, when the light was just right and the wind was just soft enough, he could still feel Martha sitting beside him, her hand in his, watching the colors change across the sky. "We did good, Harold," she would say. And Harold would smile and nod and whisper back, "Yes, Martha, we did."